Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final Oxford Minds seminar of term. Thank you very much for making time in 8th week to join us. This session of Oxford Minds is focusing on policy impact from recommendations to transformation. And I'm really delighted to say that we have 3 panelists joining us who all have significant impact through their research on policy. They cover areas ranging from education to migration and integration to climate change and COVID-19. All of them do work that has been really genuinely transformative. And so I'm really happy that we can draw upon those insights to understand how policy impact can work in practice. We were originally due to have Abby Adams-Prassel from the Economics Department join us, and due to a very sudden family emergency, she's had to withdraw, but we're really pleased that Jacqui Broadhead has been able to join us at the last minute. So let me briefly introduce our 3 speakers before we hear from each of them in turn. Professor Michelle Meadows is Associate Professor of Educational Assessment in the Department of Education. She has an extremely long history of working as a practitioner, including as Deputy Chief Regulator and Executive Director within Ofqual, which is the organisation that regulates educational assessment within England. She's also undertaken significant research on educational qualifications, the validity of those qualifications, and standard setting across educational assessment. We then have Professor Tom Hale, who's Associate Professor in Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government. Most of Tom's work focuses on the management of transnational problems, and particularly the evolution of how institutions respond to changing challenges that result from globalization and interdependence. He's worked across a broad range of areas, including environmental governance, economic governance, and health governance, and is the author of several very influential books, including in 2017, Beyond Gridlock, published with Polity Press. And most notably, Tom has led a very pioneering initiative, the Oxford COVID-19 Government Response Tracker, that's had a significant impact on policy responses to COVID. Finally, and definitely not least, we're joined by Dr. Jacqui Broadhead, who's Senior Researcher at the Global Exchange on Migration and Diversity at COMPAS, the Centre on Migration, Policy and Society. Jacqui also has a significant background of working in policy, having worked notably at the local level with Islington Council, being responsible for their refugee and migrant integration projects. She's got a significant focus in her work on cities and municipal authorities' responses to migration, and very recently has been a finalist in the ESRC Impact Prize for the work that she's done jointly with Dr. Sarah Spencer, looking at the role of cities in integrating irregular migrants. And it was an incredibly inspiring project to hear about that's changed the policies of many mayors across Europe. So couldn't be more delighted to welcome all 3 of you. And we're going to start with Michelle.
Thank you, and thank you for allowing me to participate in this. So yes, as Alex says, I work in the field of educational assessment with a particular focus on qualifications in England. So GCSEs and A-levels, but also vocational and technical qualifications, BTECs and so on. And for the past 20 years or so, I've really kind of worked at the intersection of research, policy and practice. And my job has been essentially to try and make qualifications, policy making and practice as evidence-based as possible. And there are many ways to think about research impact, but for me, impact is very much about changing policy and practice for the better. And I've worked in positions where I could influence research and policy agendas in a very direct way. So the context in which qualifications have operated over the past 20 years has been, I think, increasingly high stakes and perhaps unforgiving from the perspective of individual students. So the increased use of assessment data to hold schools and colleges to account, and indeed individual teachers to account, has put increasing pressure on qualifications. And much of my research has been about how to maintain the validity and fairness of qualifications and assessment in this context. So I thought I'd give you 3 example areas of my research and how it's related to policy. So first of all, I thought I'd mention a project that I collaborated with colleagues from Oxford on. This is a 3-year evaluation of the relative merits of modular versus linear GCSEs. So in modular GCSEs, assessments are taken in bite-sized chunks along the way throughout the course of study, whereas in linear GCSEs, all your assessment is taken at the end of the course of study. It's actually an absence of policy that led to the almost wholesale modularisation of GCSEs in the late 2000s. So the predecessor body to Ofqual, where I worked, the QCA, didn't stipulate the structure of GCSEs, and so the market of exam boards responded by almost universally offering modular GCSEs because they judged that teachers would find them preferable. And at the time, there was a surprising lack of research into the benefits of modular versus linear qualification structures. Previous research that had been done was almost exclusively qualitative research. And it showed that teachers believed that modular GCSEs would be better for less able students and would be better for disadvantaged students. In our work, we collected both qualitative and quantitative data, and we pulled together several years of examination data. And for some of the GCSEs, such as in maths, we were lucky that both modular and linear structures were available at the same time. So not only could we look at effects over time as modularity came and went, but we could also do direct comparisons. Actually, we found no evidence from the quantitative data that modular GCSEs were better for less able or for disadvantaged students. And here I mean better in the sense of leading to higher grades. We did, however, find some evidence in maths that when both modular and linear GCSEs are available at the same time, more advantaged schools made use of this choice. So they would enter students initially for the modular GCSE, and then if the students weren't performing well enough to get the magical grade C as it was then they would enter them at the last moment for the linear version. So this is probably not a great experience for the students in the sense that they were sitting all the modular examinations and then had to sit the linear qualification as well at the end. But from the teacher's perspective, it was an attempt to increase the likelihood of these students getting that all-important grade C. So we looked at modular versus linear GCSEs from a whole range of perspectives. But our conclusion was that at least in the current policy environment, linear GCSEs were probably more appropriate, not least because it was easier to maintain comparable standards in linear GCSEs. So the next time the government considers this issue, and policy making in this area is very cyclical, there'll be a much stronger evidence base to inform and challenge their thinking. I would warn, though, against generalising these conclusions to other qualification types. I imagine the balance of evidence on the usefulness of modularity in A-levels or vocational qualifications is probably actually quite different. So that's just an example of a project that really was intended to fill a gap in evidence, quite a discrete piece of work that hopefully will be useful in the long term. I've also spent the last 20 years researching all sorts of issues in relation to quality of marking. So every year in England, there's 15 million GCSE and A-level scripts that get marked, and inevitably errors occur. And with England's use of essays and constructed response questions, there are naturally professional differences of opinion as to mark worthiness of scripts. But given the stakes associated with these qualifications, of course, there is pressure to make marking as reliable as possible. But policymakers don't want to move to multiple choice style assessments because that would have a negative washback on teaching and learning in their view. Indeed, they want quite the opposite. In the latest round of reforms to qualifications, Michael Gove was then the Secretary of State, and the policy steer to Ofqual was very much that more open-ended styles of questions should be used despite the likely impact on reliability. Now, I've done lots of different kinds of research projects in this area, but for example, I did a piece of work looking at the experience, the personality and the background of examiners and whether that affects their marking. We found that it very much depends on what's being marked. There are some questions that can be marked to a very high standard by conscientious, that's important, non-teachers with a good level of general education, by which I mean really grade 4 GCSEs in English and maths. So this research was really helpful because it enabled exam boards to widen their pool of markers and use their most expert markers on those things that are really hard to mark well. So it helped solve a problem. One of the big issues though for Ofqual when I moved there was, first of all, knowing what is the level of marking reliability of these qualifications that we regulate, and second, is that good enough? So the usual way that you determine the marking reliability of an exam is that you conduct a remarking study. So you have examiners mark scripts that have been cleaned of the original marks, and you look at the level of agreement between the original marking and this fresh marking. Now, obviously, to do that on any kind of scale is really impossible. There's about 3,000 GCSE and A-level papers sat each year. You might be able to do 1 or 2 of those. So instead, we use data from exam board marker monitoring systems to create consistency metrics, marker consistency metrics. So the way in which markers are monitored involves them regularly marking what are called seed items. These are items that the senior examiners already assigned a true mark to. So the difference between the mark given by the senior examiner, this true mark, and that given by the examiner can then be used to estimate the consistency of marking. And you can do that not just for the item itself, but for the whole question paper. And indeed, then you can extrapolate to the qualification. And this has enabled Ofqual to publish each year marking consistency metrics. You can compare over time, you can compare between exam boards, and using the research literature, you can compare internationally. And these have shown that marking consistency is actually very stable over time. On the one hand, things aren't getting worse, as some commentators would have us believe, but they're not getting better either. And the levels of consistency in England are highly comparable to what you see internationally, which would come as no surprise to researchers working in this field. But to be able to demonstrate that to policymakers is very powerful. Moreover, we're now to conduct studies of things like the introduction of problem solving into GCSE maths and actually look at the impact of that on reliability. And what you see, as you'd expect, is that it does have a small detrimental effect. But then policymakers can make a judgment that they believe that lower level of marking reliability is worth the introduction of problem solving. It's a price worth paying. And just finally, I wanted to mention a project which I've just begun working on with my colleague, Professor Joanne Baird. And this is to evaluate the resilience of England's qualification system. So the cancellation of exams during the pandemic has raised questions about system resilience. And indeed, exams crises of one shape or the other come along probably about every 5 years. And there's some storms in teacups that happen even more regularly. So the Treasury had asked Ofqual to look at system resilience, and they've contracted, Ofqual have contracted Joanne and I to conduct the work. So we're looking at the moment to create a definition of system resilience, drawing on working at the complex systems such as food production and healthcare. And we'll also look at the causes of past exams crises, and we'll be interviewing some key actors in the system. So we expect to come to some conclusions in about a year's time, and we'll have some recommendations to make about what would be needed to make the system more resilient. Now, whether those recommendations will influence policymakers, well, we'll see. But I suppose one observation I'd leave you with is that being really well connected to your policymakers really, really helps. So we're hopeful. Thank you. That's what I wanted to share.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I think that's really helpful, even beyond the educational context in which you work, because you've highlighted in a way 3 different ways in which research can have policy impact: filling a discrete gap in evidence, engaging with open-ended problem solving, but also undertaking impact evaluations. And I think what you left with as well, of having strong connections to your policymakers being important, is something that hopefully we'll come back to. So thank you. Tom.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you all for joining. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk about this topic, which is near and dear to my heart. I'm going to offer 3 conceptual points and then 3 how points. So how should we think about policy impact, and then how do we do policy impact? And I'll try to model the technique as well throughout this by organizing my points in a short list of 3, which is obviously the only way policymakers process information. It's a joke, but to think a little bit how we translate our research into impact. So the first conceptual point is that impact is not some sort of process or output or activity you do at the end of a research project. I think, Alex, you mentioned sort of the broader framing at the beginning of our session. And I think we have in the UK, for example, a system that aims to quantify impact in some way as part of the general assessment of education under something called the REF, Research Excellence Framework. Michelle, I'd be curious your thoughts on that aspect, perhaps from your expertise. But I think my own view on it, and it's a personal view, is very much that it's quite reductionist. It tries to think about impact as something that happens at the end of a research project, where you take your paper, it goes to give it to a policymaker, that policymaker does something with it that then creates a change in the world. And I think this is not really how impact happens, really, and how we as scholars should think about our role in society, which is a very important role for those who are doing policy engagement, which I would say is more a technique, as opposed to impact, which is the overall effect of our work. And I'll just offer the well-known John Maynard Keynes quote on how this works, where he said, "Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back." So the point is that someone doing pure ivory tower work, far removed from policy engagement, might actually be having a very big impact if he or she is doing, creating ideas that go on to really shape the way people see the world. And I would encourage everyone thinking about their impact as a scholar to think about it in that very holistic way. I would add to Keynes that probably the biggest impact any of us have as scholars is through teaching, through our students, because the multiple effect is just so vast. If you teach 100 students, then your impact through them is going to be, somebody shaping one idea in their heads. That's still quite a big impact. So first conceptual point, let's think about impact in a holistic way. Second point is that I think policy engagement, which is I would categorize as a subset of impact, looking at how scholars and policymakers interface, is a very important tool. And I think it's also valuable, not just because it's assisting policymakers to have access to academic expertise, but actually is a very important tool for getting better scholarship. And I see it actually as having huge value to us as scholars in universities, as well as hopefully to societies in which we're based. I find it a very useful way to ask the right kinds of questions, to really put yourself into the shoes of people asking difficult questions, implementation of operation, and as a way to ask questions that aren't just going to be a footnote in someone else's paper, but actually questions that will be meaningful, substantive, deep questions that actually can create new opportunities and get your creative juices flowing in a way that's going to lead to new theoretical insights. So it's a really great source of questions and puzzles. And there's lots of ways to do policy engagement. say a bit more about it in a second, but I think people underestimate the most easy way, which is to offer to help. Policymakers are so stretched. They have so little access to time. Time is the most precious resource. If you as an academic can kind of help and offer, that will be well received in most cases. There might be some trust issues, there might be some relationships need to get built, but once you have those, the door is really open to contributing, because that's one thing no one in a policymaking context can find is sort of free time and energy from smart people who are interested in helping them solve the problem. So that's a really useful door to push on. Final conceptual point is that I think we sometimes, for the reasons perhaps of evaluation, sort of present policy engagement or impact as a one-size-fits-all option for especially early career researchers. Like, you must talk about your paper with these policymakers now. Actually, I think if we see it, as I'm trying to suggest, as sort of a method that can help scholarship, then we shouldn't expect every single academic to do the same kind of policy engagement. Indeed, some may not do any. I think the field as a whole, discipline as a whole, will benefit hugely if there are people who are at that interface of policy and scholarship, who are communicating ideas that emerge from that interface back into the discipline, to the kinds of questions people are asking and the data that's being brought to bear on them. But we shouldn't expect every single person to do this, like just as we wouldn't expect every single scholar to do this one method or that one method. So yeah, let's think about it in that holistic sense. Okay, so those are my I call them conceptual points, but they're more rants, I guess. So if you use a few, I welcome people's thoughts on. 3 points on how. How can we, as scholars, have a positive impact? And I don't, as per my last point, I don't think these are the only ways or the ones that necessarily the best ones. There's ones that I've found personally quite helpful. So I just wanted to share them in that spirit and offer an anecdote on each one. The first is through convening. I think academics sort of don't see this one because we often find it difficult to see why anyone would want to talk to us, but actually academics have huge ability to convene people because we have this sort of neutral role as thinkers, as researchers, as evaluators. And so in the policy context, a lot of times it's very hard to find someone who doesn't have an institutional domain or turf war that they're fighting. And so actually academics, because it's not our job to fight those wars, we have this kind of unique ability to be that neutral point of convergence. And so I'd encourage people to think about having impact by just bringing people to a common table and framing that question discussion in a way you would a seminar. And actually probably all of the people on this call, many of you at least have had experience teaching seminars, right? So you know how to have a group of people with different ideas and lead them through a conversation where they feel out those ideas and learn how to relate to each other and to the material at hand. That's kind of what convening policymakers can look like for academics. And I've found many contexts where different groups of policymakers didn't have a forum to talk to each other, where just offering that table to talk around, or Zoom call, as the case might be, was hugely appreciated. Just one quick example of that. So in 2014, there's a big effort by different NGOs, by the UN, and by different private sector organizations to provide tracking of those actions being taken by cities, businesses, investors on climate change. So a new thing, these actors were getting involved in global climate change debates, and people wanted to say, okay, how many cities are actually doing something? How many companies have made this kind of commitment? And there are lots of different egos and interests at stake. And so I was able to bring many of them to Oxford for a workshop, and we hashed it out and thought actually got everyone to sort of take one step back away from their institutional context and see what is a system that could do that. And that led to the creation of this UN portal, which now provides that function for all of those different actors. So it wasn't like I designed it and implemented it and this is my idea, now I'm bringing it to you policymakers, please do this. It was more, I just saw there was a need for it. Everyone actually saw there was a need for it. We happened to be able to convene it in Oxford, and that crystallized the conversation that allowed it to happen. So that was on convening. Second, how I think is really important is on clarifying. So often in social science, especially some disciplines more than others, but throughout the whole set of disciplines, there's a real value, of course, on explanation, on causal inference, on trying to figure out theoretically why things work and then showing that those things indeed work the way you think they do. And I think we undervalue a little bit as academics our ability to actually just do clear description in a way that helps organize the complexity of the world into a mental map for students, for scholars, and indeed for policymakers. So having very clear concepts, clear taxonomies, clear typologies is actually hugely valuable. And it's not, I think if you think about it, there's a lot of examples of this where we in the academy kind of poo-poo the book that has a catchy metaphor or kind of this like calling it some neologism that captures people's attention. But those books are successful. I'm not saying they need to be published in the top journals, but they're successful in helping organize complexity in the world because it gives people a model to follow. And I think we can really do a lot of value as academics in that space. People love ideas that help them simplify complexity. And that's what good theory should do, right? That's what a good model should do. That's what a good scholarship, in my view, should do, is help us make sense of complex social systems. Sometimes academics also want to problematize and complexify, and that's also a valuable skill, right? We often can add that nuance and the shades of gray that need to be there. But I think for policymakers in particular, they're so overwhelmed by shades of gray that they often are seeking clarity, and that's something scholars can do. And I think there's a quote I really like from Nan Cohen, who's a former president of Duke University and Wesleyan, who says, leadership is the ability to articulate a common vision for a group of people and then help people get to that common vision. So I think the same applies for scholars and policy debates. The final how question is on contextualization. So this kind of thing comes back to what you were saying a bit, Michelle, on how do you, policymakers always want to know where they fall in the larger scheme of things. And we as scholars can really see some of that larger context in a way that people who are looking at from a certain vantage point can't. So, what is the status of this issue? I'm interested in, say, how are these net zero targets looking like, or how is this coverage COVID policy looking like, and how does that compare to its peers? And can we put some sort of parameters onto making that comparison? And that can be done in a qualitative way, or it can be done with data. And either way, academics have a huge ability to make that kind of contextualization in a way that policymakers often don't. And we in the COVID tracker project that Alex mentioned have really tried to think about how we can have a comparative system for putting the very complex landscape of government responses to COVID into a pretty simple comparative way to enable scholarship, but also to enable governments to compare themselves to each other. And simplicity really helps, but simplicity is also like a window onto more nuance. So we shouldn't try to think about it as like, you must put it into this box or that box, or rather by putting things into boxes, you're helping facilitate a conversation where you can begin to explain, actually, is that like that? Or is this, if there are similar, why is this difference emerge? Yeah, I think the demand for that is really limitless. With the COVID tracking project, it's really followed the sort of adage, if you build the data, they will come. Like if you have the data, if you have the information, people will be banging down your door. So policy engagement won't be something that you need to kind of go out and get your paper into people's faces, but rather something that emerges very naturally and organically. So yeah, contextualization, very important. You'll notice that those 3 how questions were 3 C's. So this is also a good tactic, having similar alliteration or things. But no, it's just my own experiences on convening, clarifying, and contextualizing. Very important stuff. And I think if you're able to do those things well, you'll also be a much better scholar, because that's a lot of the thinking around what goes into, I think, a good piece of scholarship. How do you define the problem well? How do you organize the information in a way that's clear? And how do you put it in the context? So, Alex, those are my 3 ideas.
That's such a helpful 3 C's, so brilliantly framed, and really great that you highlight as well that policy engagement is a method, and it's one we can build in from the start, but it's 2-directional. It's we can identify questions and agendas from those conversations just as we can inform policy. But I really like the convening, clarifying, and contextualizing. Thank you. Jacqui, over to you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, and I shall definitely be drawing on both of the kind of previous contributions because they echo a lot of my thoughts. I want to talk briefly about the city working group model that Alex mentioned in the introduction, and then some of the principles and learning that we've drawn from that. So as was alluded to, I have come the other way in that I came over from policymaking into research and academia, which sort of gives a slightly different perspective, I guess, in some ways, but very similar to some of the principles that were drawn on earlier. And I would just reiterate that idea of policy engagement as being something that has to be a choice, and that happens as early as possible in the process. So our city working group model is basically a couple of projects that we have that came out of research on migration and integration. So we have a project in the UK called Inclusive Cities, and a project that works throughout Europe called CMIS, which is the City Initiative on Irregular Migrants with Irregular Status in Europe. And they both came out of pieces of specific research that developed models. One is a model of migrant integration, a sort of standard academic theoretical model, and then work on irregularity, but that they also both identified policy problems, which is essentially that these are topics that are the responsibility of local government often. They don't attract a lot of resource, and they don't attract a lot of either policy interest, because they're not topics often that city leaders have a lot of incentive to talk about, and that academics generally, if they engage, they often engaged on the national level. Or perhaps at international level, but very rarely did they engage with city leaders. And so these were both very kind of specific initiatives that were aimed at developing methods of engagement that could bring city leaders to the table, and could draw on that research, but allow for kind of sustained programs of policy engagement and impact. And so the sort of key factors I would say that have kind of drawn out of that project, the first would be the importance that I don't think we realised at all at the start of the project of facilitating space, which very much kind of speaks to the convening point. I was nodding my head along vigorously at that. We didn't realise that actually that would be one of the most valuable contributions of the project, would simply be there is nobody else who has been convening, particularly for migrants with irregular status. There's nobody else who had been convening. The big international groups hadn't wanted to convene on such a controversial topic, and the mayors themselves hadn't done it, and so there was no real forum. And so having that space and the structure for peer learning proved to be very valuable, even without the input of our research or anything else that we were doing. Just providing that space had kind of value in and of itself. Secondly is that point about synthesizing. So we spend a lot of time synthesizing our research for policy audiences, and that doesn't mean dumbing it down, and that doesn't mean that doesn't mean taking out the nuance or the complexity. It simply means acknowledging and understanding the restraints that policymakers are working under, and also what they are going to be able to use and benefit from. So we try to make sure that our resources, the form matches the content in a sense. So instead of saying here's a model on integration, we say here are some resources that basically follow that model. And that generally is an easier way for them to kind of interact with those resources, rather than trying to say here's a theoretical model that we want you to sort of take on. And finally, that we find that what comes out of that generally helps to feed into our future research agendas. But there are a couple of caveats that I would sort of put into that and kind of want to put up front. So the first is there's a really nice diagram to the Daniel Pinnock novel, The Rights of the Reader. It's a Quentin Blake illustration. It has the 10 rights of the reader, and the first is the right not to read. And I always say that like for our work, the right not to do impact has to be kind of one of the first ones. Research has intrinsic value in and of itself. Some research is very well suited to this type of work, and some researchers are, but some aren't. And my view is that you should either be all in or not. Like doing this half-heartedly, to me, is kind of the worst of all worlds. And so that kind of right not to do impact has to be sort of central, and that has to be there, because that's what's going to kind of mean that we generate really high quality policy engagement, where the researchers are kind of committed to it and it matches their aims and expectations. But shoehorning everybody into doing this type of work, I think, is a mistake. The second is about migration. So migration is an area in particular that, you know, as I'm sure you'll all know, has its own sort of quirks in terms of the lack of policy consensus, in terms of, as I spoke to earlier, people feeling quite nervous to speak about them, but also about the types of people who choose to research migration. Often it's people who are, as for every topic I imagine, incredibly passionate about the topic that they're studying. And often with a goal of pursuing social change as well as what they're aiming to kind of study from their research. And one of the things, activism through, that's not the topic that we're looking at here, of kind of activist academics, but I think one of the things that we've seen with policy engagement is having that clarity between when you're drawing on your research specifically and when you're giving your opinions about what you think of the way the world is and the way that the world should be. Having that kind of clarity is very important. So making sure that you know kind of under what guise you're speaking. Similarly, and again, I'm drawing on migration research as that's what I know about, but your research is also going into a context. It's going into a political context, and there's really excellent scholarship on the political uses of expert knowledge. And so there's an importance of a kind of awareness of that, of the way that your research is instrumentalized or is used to kind of legitimize policy discussions as well as to inform it. And similarly, that policymakers are all operating under their own kind of bounded rationality. And Michelle spoke about providing evidence, kind of evidence-based policymaking. But we also know from really excellent research that policymakers make decisions based on their kind of gut instincts, based on what they're able to kind of grab at any one moment. And so there's kind of responsibility both to kind of think about that, but also that can be an underexplored aspect of some of this, that it's not simply, you're not simply kind of objectively providing research evidence that then is just drawn upon in a kind of neutral, free environment. Your research expertise is going into an environment, and the conditions that you create, either through your convening or through the type of peer learning that you're facilitating, also have influence as well as just what your kind of research is saying. So given all of that, there are a few principles that we've drawn out from the work that we've done, and a few lessons that we try to kind of hold dear. So the first is the principles of knowledge exchange essentially have to be that there isn't a kind of monopoly on expert knowledge. It's about that conversation and that dialogue between yourselves and with the policymakers. So the idea that you are able to share your expertise, but also that you're able to take back and draw into your research questions and findings what's coming back, and that ideally that should be on a level footing, and that you're developing partnerships over the long term, and that both sides have realistic expectations of what they're going to get out of them. From our point of view, a lot of the work that we do is with local government, and I would just put a shout out to partnerships with local government. Thomas talked about the fact that policymakers often don't have very many resources. I think that's multiplied several times over at the local level in terms of the access to research expertise that they're getting. And I would also talk about, particularly for early and mid-career scholars, the importance of cultivating networks and skills amongst your peers. Quite often, particularly if you're thinking about your ref impact case study or whatever, there's a temptation to want to go straight to the top. And obviously that has lots of value, but I think generating networks over time that are effectively working with your peers, people who are at your career stage within the organisations that you're interested in, people that you're going to take those relationships through, feels to me a kind of really valuable use of a kind of investment in building your skills and expertise and networks in policy engagement, if that's the thing that you're interested in. Again, the point was made, but I think that including this type of policy engagement, knowledge exchange and impact work within your research design as early on as possible, and not seeing it as an add-on, for two reasons. First is that will just improve the quality of what you're trying to do in terms of that engagement, but secondly, because it also requires funding. And I sometimes see that it's something that's seen as an extra that can be added on to, that can be bolted onto research projects. But I think getting into the discipline of putting in what it actually costs to do this type of work, both the actual costs in terms of your time, but also the kind of opportunity costs as well. And I think I will end it there, but that was some reflections on some of our work, and I look forward to the conversation.
Jacqui, that was great. Loads of great tips and advice. Do it properly or not at all. Build your skills. Know which hat you're wearing in terms of, are you a researcher speaking to policymakers, or are you doing advocacy? Make your knowledge exchange reciprocal. Be aware of the political context you're working in. So I think this has been a terrific set of reflections, really coherent in a way. Michelle telling us about types of research that can have policy impact. Tom telling us about types of policy engagement by researchers, even beyond the evidence and the research itself. And Jacqui telling us about principles that should underlie responsible policy engagement. So the floor's open for questions. Feel free to put any questions or comments in the chat or the Q&A. Perhaps I could also just start with a question that builds on something Jacqui asked. And I think it's Jacqui raised the point about early career researchers in particular, and practicing skills for policy engagement and refining them. But I think another challenge that sometimes makes this area a bit daunting for people is, how do you build your networks? To Michelle's point at the start, where you said you got to know your policymakers. You're all working in networks, and you've built networks in these different areas that you referred to, from education to migration to COVID-19. How do you get to know the right people? How do you identify the policymakers to whom you want to talk, that can become part of your circle and build those relationships? So whoever wants to go first with that, it'd be great to have some reflections on how you do that, but also what it means for someone early in their research career.
Happy to have a quick thought on that one. I think, there's sort of an unfortunate conventional wisdom that policy impact is also something you do kind of when you're in your academic dotage, after you've gotten tenure and you're not, doing cutting edge research anymore, and you can kind of go around to the policy people and tell war stories, and and I think this is wrong in lots of ways. But I think Jacqui made the perfect point that sometimes the most productive linkages are more junior people in organizations. Often these are the people who are tasked with doing research, right? They're writing the memos that then get fed up to senior policymakers, and they are, writing a memo every day and a new topic. If you're in say a cabinet office kind of position, and you need someone to help you, and that's a really productive relationship. So I'd say if you're an early career researcher and you have a way to link to those people, that'd be great. The way to do so, in my mind, is to make yourself available. We in Oxford are very lucky. Lots of policymakers come through all the time, and go to their talks, meet them, say how your research helps, ask if you can help contribute in some way, and the door will be more open than probably you expect it to be.
Thanks, Tom. Michelle?
Yeah, just I absolutely agree, and just an observation that often policymakers have advisory groups and the like, and they're looking at their advisory groups and thinking, well, I'm only speaking here about educational assessment, but I suspect that this is true of other areas. They're looking around and thinking, hang on, I've mostly got males, they're mostly white, and they are at the old end of the spectrum. And actually getting young and different voices along to those kinds of advisory groups is a real challenge for policymakers. So I would encourage younger researchers, early career researchers, to reach out, because, well, certainly in my field, that's exactly the kind of contact that people are looking for.
Yeah, I think lots of nodding across the panel, and I think I certainly agree with that. Jacqui?
Yeah, I think most of it's been said. I know that there definitely is the challenge of, spreading oneself too thin as well. So I think thinking about, what's the policy challenge that you're really interested in, matching where the things that are coming up in your research really are kind of chiming with policy topics. They don't always have to be the things that are at the top of the list in terms of topicality. I mean, I do a lot of work on migrant integration. I can tell you that is not for most local authorities at the top of their policy pile. So you find the way in. But I think sort of choosing what you want to do and making those connections quite mindfully, and some of them will work and some of them won't. And I also think having the other way around from Michelle's point, which is having advisory groups and steering groups for your own research. So that's a really good way of basically ensuring when you want to do the dissemination side of things, you already have a group who are kind of there, but it also means that they have had the chance to feed in as you're developing the research. So it means that it's more likely that it'll be applicable and of interest to them. And that I know I've given that piece of advice a lot, and people find that daunting. They say, well, I can't invite people, I don't have anything to say. But actually, a lot of policymakers get very frustrated by research where they say, well, if we'd have been involved earlier, we would have had some ideas on how you might have shaped this slightly differently.
Brilliant set of reflections. We've got some more questions and comments starting to emerge. We've got a comment from Will Pryor. Those of you who don't know Will, he leads on policy engagement within the university and has set up initiatives like the Oxford Policy Engagement Network, which exists in the university and provides some very helpful guidance. So I'll drop a link in the chat to the guidance that he and his team provide. But he offers a comment and says, really good point by Jacqui about modes of engagement. If others haven't come across this, he recommends Roger Pielka's 5 modes and suggests it's worth a quick read, and has dropped that in the chat box for everyone to look at. Then we've got a couple of quick questions from Mark for Tom, and you can all read them in the chat, but I'll go through them briefly. He says, I would suggest that transformation that sticks is only possible within structured or at least semi-structured communities. The climate change activist community is notoriously disjointed, including academics. First question on that, would you say that at COP26 there were signs of the groups putting differences behind them and starting to speak with one voice, and thereby being more effective in steadily forcing transformation on policymakers? And question 2, if the convening force of a UN COP is not enough to bring that community together, then what could? And this might be a question that resonates for others. So I know Jacqui was hinting at the kind of the divided and sometimes different opinions within the migration debate and the lack of consensus amongst academics and policymakers. And I can imagine in education, there are also different schools of thought. So let's start with Tom on those questions about the unity or otherwise within the community and its implications. And then if Jacqui or Michelle would like to add something, then feel free.
It's a great question, Mark. Nice to hear from you. I think in climate change, as in many contested spheres of policy debate, there's a real, sometimes healthy, sometimes unhealthy discussion between, if you will, insider and outsider strategies from academics, from mostly activists, from philanthropy, from other kinds of players in the system. Do you kind of go inside the system and try to make incremental change from within, where you have access to levers of power, or do you shout from the outside and really try to create the conditions for driving change? And I think different people as individuals feel that choice differently. Some people go back and forth between the two. I guess I describe myself more in that latter mode. And I think as an academic, we can probably see lots of conditions under which both of those two things actually work well in tandem to drive an overall outcome, as opposed to being either or, as opposed to a both and answer. I think in Glasgow COP26, we saw a little bit of disjointedness, as you say, Mark, between those two strategies overall, and kind of this conflicting narrative, which is it's not good enough, or some progress being made. And so I think there's a real challenge for academics working in that space, but also activists and also the philanthropic community that's supporting both of them to make those forces push in the same direction. But I think for scholars considering policy engagement, this is a really important choice. And do you see yourself as sitting whispering to the ear of the Prime Minister, trying to make sure those who hold power are making decisions effectively, or do you see your role as actually helping the groups write the report that will expose the grave injustice? And those are both places where scholarship has a huge amount to contribute, and we're actually the voice of an independent academic. And, frankly, just to be very blunt, the voice of an independent academic attached to a very well-known university can be hugely consequential and influential. And so it's a real responsibility to think about how do you do that responsibly. And I would encourage all of academics who are thinking about inside strategies or outside ones to remember you're hopefully always an academic. You maybe you're doing one or the other or both, so mix of the two. But when you, I think you lose something if you give yourself wholly over to one of those together and lose your kind of academic perspective.
And I think a really important insight into the kind of Oxford factor as well, that the brand resonates, has credibility, opens up policy doors, but requires that we use that responsibly, that it's a sort of public good within Oxford for all members of that community, and to preserve that credibility and the trust that it creates. Jacqui, Michelle, do you want to have any reflections? Jacqui, go ahead.
Sure, yeah, I would just say that I don't think that that within the kind of migration work that we're doing, that we're looking for coherence necessarily. It's an ecosystem, and that's actually helpful. So to give just a very practical example, we're doing work on irregular migration that's working directly with mayors, and that's basically looking at this idea that cities have different responsibilities on migration. They're not the agents of border enforcement by and large, but usually they have wider responsibilities to things like community cohesion, or to public health, or to preventing homelessness. And so it can be helpful for those city mayors to develop their policies based on those ideas. So we look at, and from our research, we draw out that framing, we use theories of multi-level governance of migration. Does that mean that I'm not incredibly grateful for colleagues who are looking at things like the hostile environment in the UK and the way that that has been implemented, the violence of some of the bordering that happens, and the way that immigration enforcement tentacles kind of spreading into different areas? No, it doesn't at all. Both of those things I think coexist helpfully, and actually they speak to each other, and they help to kind of reinforce both of those. I think research agendas should help to kind of reinforce each other. And I don't think, like, we don't view our work as trying to kind of gain some sort of supremacy over that type of work. I think that they are complementary because they're trying to do different things. And so it doesn't to me feel like a tension, or where it is a tension, it's a kind of creative and productive one, hopefully.
Great. We've got a question from Alex, which is kind of a provocative question, which is, how much value do you think that professional policy brokers add to the policy engagement process? It's been a growth area in higher education in recent years. Full disclosure, I have been one of those professionals. What can people in these roles do to better support researchers? So do you think that they add value to your work? And what role could they play to potentially add value to your work? Michelle, go ahead.
Well, I should say that I've not experienced this in this context. I've not come across this yet, having only recently rejoined academia. But I think I've worked with people in similar roles within organisations, and their ability to map key stakeholders, do legwork in terms of keeping researchers in touch with people, keeping them having the right conversations. In those contexts, I found it incredibly helpful. I've not experienced it yet in HE though, so helpfully I can't comment on that.
Let me just share two big experiences on this. One positive, one less positive. So less positive one was a case where there's a project funded by a research council. The funders had a very strong interest in showing that there are lots of policy impacts. And so the person who was playing this role felt that their job was to create a large list of things that have been done that could be counted in this list of policy impacts. And so they're very output focused and kind of really trying to basically, it ended up sending the academics of the project a lot of requests to write up a few bullet points on how they had talked to this policymaker, how they talked to that policymaker. So it was really adding emails to people's credit inboxes without any kind of actual policy impact. It is more like for funding. So that's obviously not a great way to do it. It comes back to the instrumentalization of impact that I think is a bit of a push for its trend. A completely other example would be someone who really comes in because they're passionate about the work and they want to contribute to it. And they're often someone, in my experience, have been people who are like just between the kind of undergraduate master's level and then wanting to go into a PhD, and so are really thinking about the world as this is a step on their academic pathway, but have a real passion for the topic at hand. And I've often seen people in that role learn a huge amount about research in these kinds of roles, and also add a huge amount of value to the project as kind of somewhere, I don't know, between a sort of policy-facing postdoc without actually having a PhD at kind of function, and that's been great.
Jacqui, do you want to add anything?
I would say basically where there can be added value is often on the skills that the academics find harder to bring. So some of the synthesis that we talked about, the kind of communications work, design, those type of areas for some of the kind of outputs. I think that there is potential for bringing together collaboration as well, but often that tends to be, I think, within the university. So brokers who have knowledge of other people who are building policy networks in other parts of the university. I think it's more tricky to kind of ask a broker to bring you a policy network or a policy contact ready-made. I don't think there's really any substitute for building those networks yourself, because it's your passion and your research. You're going to be the one who's going to be able to kind of talk about it in the most compelling way. But I think building those kind of networks behind the scenes and also providing support and training on some of the stuff that we've been talking about today, I think there can be real added value there.
Fantastic. And I think we've got time for one more question, which is a nice question to end on, which comes from Konstantin, which is some of the different routes of policy engagement have already been discussed. But can the speakers comment on how they think that DPhil students, whose research could make an important contribution to the policy debate, should go about starting policy engagement? How can the university support them in this endeavour? So in terms of the university, as we've said, we've got support within the university from people like Will Pryor, from the engagement, some of the links that have been shared. So draw upon those. But I think to close, it would be great to get a final thought from each of you about what advice you would give in a few sentences to a DPhil student who's doing work that has policy relevance. How could they start policy engagement? And we'll perhaps go in reverse order from the panel. So Jacqui, let's begin with you.
I think for me, really, it's about the kind of, the things that you have identified within your research that you think have this kind of policy impact. I think the first thing would be testing that out with as many people as possible to get the feedback on, does that actually match their needs and their expectations? And then I think some of the areas for kind of impact seed funding that there are in the university, looking for some of those and thinking about whether then there is a way of sort of transforming that over into convening work that can bring people together and kind of start to build some of those kind of skills and networks that we've been talking about.
I think it's a great question. My first view is that a good DPhil is a done DPhil, so don't feel like this is something that you need to cram into the precious few years you have to write that beautiful document. It's one step on a journey, and the journey will include policy engagement if you want to, and that's doesn't always be done at the same time, but it can be done sequentially. That said, if you have opportunities to get involved in some policy engagement that are maybe aligned to or supportive of your DPhil, or just something you're really passionate about and they're able to fit it all in, I think it's a wonderful thing to do. And I think, just to reiterate what I think I said before, the best way to do it is to try to build those connections to the operational level people in the organizations that you're studying or interested in, and to give them help answering the research questions that they're trying to get in front of their bosses in short, succinct form. And if you can do that well, you'll, I think, find a lot of doors open to you.
I guess one thing that we've not mentioned, of course, is that often in a particular policy area, there'll be a key conference, often annually, where people gather together. So knowing about that conference and just getting yourself along and talking to people is going to be incredibly important. And yeah, don't be worried about making contacts with people, sometimes just by email or phoning people up who you think might be interested in your work. Important to remember, yes, people are really, really busy, but most of the time they're really open to this kind of contact and really want to help and discuss this kind of work. So taking the plunge, which, you know, can feel a bit scary, but can be incredibly rewarding.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michelle, Tom, Jacqui. I've learned an awful lot from this. I found it a remarkably coherent conversation, full of practical advice. And so I'm really grateful for all the thought you put into this, all the engagement with the questions. Dare I say it, to draw upon 3 C's, it's been clear, coherent and compelling across the board. So thank you. And thank you to all of you who have joined us and helped make the Oxford Minds series a great success this term. I wish you all a fantastic break and see you in the new year.